Okay, welcome everyone. Let's get started. First, I want to welcome everyone to this webinar, Jungian Psychology and Current Events, presented by Glen Slater, Ph.D., who is the co-chair of the Jungian Psychology and Archetypal Studies program. I'm Jessica Rubenstein. I work in the admissions team here at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And so the format of this webinar today is we are going to have a speaker presentation by Dr. Slater. And then in the last 10 minutes, you will have the opportunity to ask any questions that you might have to Dr. Slater in the Q&A section at the bottom. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see the Q&A function. And again, in the last 10 minutes, I will make an announcement once Dr. Slater is finished with his talk that we are taking questions. So you will get the chance to ask any questions about his talk. I also wanted to remind you all that participants in this webinar get the $75 application fee to apply to the Pacifica Graduate Institute waived. So if you go back to the landing page on the link you were sent out for this webinar, there should be a tab with different resources, and there should be a tab for the free application page. You can also email admissions@pacifica.edu if you have any questions about or issues filling out the application. Okay, with that, let's get started. Again, this is Dr. Slater, and we hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thanks, Jessica. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. You know, the purpose of these webinars, first of all, to introduce potential students for our various programs. And I'm the co-chair of the Jungian Archetypal Studies program, which is part of one of our depth degrees, doctoral degrees in depth psychology. But also we want to give you a flavor of the kinds of conversations we have, what the approach, the Jungian approach looks like. And as we were thinking about this webinar, it just occurred to us that it might be a good idea to address what's going on in the world. And so I just have a few thoughts to offer around that. Of course, these are enormous topics and they have a lot of gravity and complexity. But I think it's worthwhile just seeing the way in which Jungian depth psychological ideas might have something to say about what is happening. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about just the program, some general principles that we might come across in Jungian psychology, and then, you know, let's see how they are relevant to both the virus situation and also the events of the past couple of weeks after the killing of George Floyd. And then at the end, I'm just going to finish off by discussing the admissions requirements, what we look for, the kind of students who come into the program. So that's an overview, and I'll make sure I leave time at the end for some questions and discussion. So depth psychology really is that broad term that has to do with those theories and approaches that have to do with the idea of the unconscious. The term came out in the 19th century as the sort of philosophical precursors to Freud and Jung were underway. There was a lot of thinking in Romantic philosophy already about the idea of the unconscious. And, you know, Pacifica has historically had this Jungian emphasis, approach. And it has also been, over the years, very influenced by the work of James Hillman, who's arguably the most prominent Jungian following Jung. And Hillman was an active participant in Pacifica events for many years and would come and conduct seminars. So our program, Jungian Archetypal Studies, is really designating the primarily umbrella approach of Jungian psychology, but we do give special place to the work of James Hillman and the significance of his stream of thinking. Now, right there, we immediately meet what I think is quite distinct about our program, because one of Hillman's projects was to bring the ideas of depth psychology, Jungian psychology, out of the confines of psychotherapy and what goes on in the consulting room, and apply them to what's happening in the world, to the challenges of the ecological situation, to the way we design our cities and towns, to social discourse, the arts, and in this way, to understand that when we talk about the psyche, or the more poetic term, the soul, that it isn't just an introspective business. It's not simply about analysis as such, but it is also about looking at the way the psyche is manifesting, the patterns of the psyche are showing up in the events taking place around us. So we do, of course, study the psychodynamics, the individuation process, everything that pertains to that whole realm of self-understanding and self-exploration. But we're also very interested in the program in how Jungian psychology is relevant to the larger course of society. So now, if someone were to ask me how to just get into the specifically Jungian approach to things, there's three areas that come to mind. First of all, the idea that there is an imperative in life, in the psyche itself, to become more conscious. Those of you who are somewhat familiar with Jung know he talked about the movement towards psychic totality, or sometimes wholeness. Now, that doesn't mean knowing everything there is to know, or being aware of everything there is to be aware of, but it does mean paying attention to what seems to want to come into consciousness, whether that is coming up in our own psyches, in our emotional life, our dreams, our thoughts, fantasies, or is it coming from the outside? Are events trying to wake us up? Certain things that seem to fatefully happen to us, and we know that it's not just an outer event, it's saying something about our inner life too. So that movement towards consciousness is very important. Secondly, the question of meaning. Jung famously declared that of all the people he worked with in the second half of life, there wasn't one whose quote unquote psychological problem didn't come back to a spiritual problem, or a problem of meaning in terms of how does my life fit into the larger scheme of things. And the third piece that I think is particularly Jungian is the idea that when a problem occurs, when there is a psychological symptom, a disturbance, then what we look for is a hidden purpose. Jung had the idea that what wounds us, what disturbs us, is also what invites us into our deeper character, what is in a way announcing some movement that's trying to take place in the psyche. So already you see how these ideas, of course, they relate to inner life, but they also have something to do with outer life as well. Now, whereas Freud, famously declared that the repressed always returns, Jung's take on that, or the twist that he brings to that general principle of depth psychology, is that when the repressed returns, it comes back in archetypal form. It expresses these universal patterns of the psyche. And of course, that's Jung's great contribution to psychology, this discovery of this deeper layer, this universal layer that he called the collective unconscious, or often in his later work, he used the term the objective psyche. So when things come up from the unconscious, when the repressed returns, it comes back expressive of these universal patterns. And most of us are pretty used to thinking about archetypes in their personified form. So, famously, Jung talked about the wise old person, the wise old man, the crone, or the hero, or the trickster. The anima animus was part of his theory of masculine and feminine figures that are at work in our psyches. But what we sometimes forget with Jung is that archetypes are also processes. They're archetypal processes like marriage, like initiation, like sacrifice. And perhaps even more important, and this is where I want to take us in looking at the current events, is that there are certain dynamics of psychological life that are archetypal in the sense that we're always encountering them in one way or another, that they structure our lived experience. And for Jung, primarily among these archetypal dynamics are a couple that I want to talk about in particular. And one is compensation. That for Jung, the unconscious wasn't just a realm that was sort of pressured to come back into consciousness. It had a sort of intentionality, and part of that intentionality is to compensate for the one-sidedness of our conscious attitudes and framework. And already there you see where the sense of meaning or purpose comes in, because just the very question, well, what is that compensation for, becomes quite important. And often what is being compensated? Well, a couple of things. One is that we tend to turn our backs on the past, okay? So part of what is compensatory is all of the things in life that have us look back, turn around, reflect. In a way, from the psychological standpoint, the past never goes away. The past is still in us, and that's in a way what the archetypes are. They're the presence of the past, the sort of structures of human experience and imagination that one imagines belong to the brain structure, or correlate to that in some way. And the other thing that is coming back from the unconscious that we're called to pay attention to is what Jung called the shadow. And shadow is not just the things that we suppress or repress because we don't find them compatible with our normal everyday attitudes or our idea of ourselves. But the shadow is something that is dynamically being created as we live, because we tend to live in these one-sided ways. So the shadow gets loaded up. And the other dynamic that goes hand in hand with the shadow in particular is projection, that the things we tend not to want to see, we project onto other people or other things or movements. And this, in a way, is a defensive response. It relieves the sort of psychic pressure. But again, when there's a shadow projection, and usually that creates some problems because of that split within us, and also the way in which we're seeing something out there that doesn't really exist, or is at least distorted. That if we can look at the projections, that there is something the psyche is trying to say, or something the psyche is trying to remind us of. So for Jung, it's not just a matter of resolving the projection or withdrawing it. It's a matter of trying to understand what has created this kind of split or one-sidedness in the first place. So with those few ideas, let me just offer a few thoughts. And as I said, this is very preliminary. These are the things that have occurred to me as I've, of course, been taking in what has been happening. And I want to start with the virus, not just because the virus is what came first and is in a way so encompassing, but also because I think that the way in which we've responded to the virus, the psychic response, plays into, in a compelling way, our response to the death of George Floyd, and the way in which the protest movement and all of the feeling that has gone with that has come about. So stepping back a little bit, I mean, think about what it has meant to live through this time, to confront this situation of a deadly virus. And the first thing of obvious importance is just that, the death. What are we up to now? Over 110,000 people who have died. And of course, whenever death enters, psychologically speaking, it brings us back to everything that's essential. It reminds us of what is most important, what is most critical in life. It forces us in a way to come to terms with what it is about being human that allows us to participate in communities, to experience deep relationships and so on. So that's critical. The other thing, and I'm just going through the sort of basics before digging a little deeper, is the challenge of the whole thing. And I think we've seen some extraordinary courage and tenacity in terms of trying to meet this challenge. The way in which, people in the helping professions, hospitals, first responders and so forth have had to kind of step up and relentlessly meet this situation. In a way, it has shown the very best of the human response. And I think for most of us, the third thing is the isolation, that the situation has forced us into this experience of isolation. And what has happened around that psychologically? Well, very often when something is absent, it becomes psychologically very present. And I have seen and discussed with many people the way in which there's been a revivification of our sense of connection with each other because of the absence of that. For many people, it's been an extraordinarily lonely time. And of course, we've tried to connect on the internet and do what we're doing today and so on. But it doesn't quite overcome that feeling. So all of those things are in the mix here. And what they seem to point to is the way in which we're all in the same boat, which sounds like a truism, but it seems as though that's what we've been reminded of with the virus situation. One of the things depth psychology likes to do is, in terms of stepping into something a little more deeply, is to look at etymology. And the etymology of virus is quite interesting because it comes from a Latin word which simply points to, literally slimy liquid poison, the venom that would come from a snake bite, for example. So it's that side of nature that is destructive. And that root VIR also relates to words like virile. And VIR just means man in Latin. So there's an interesting thing to think about. But if we take that and we add in, we look at the word pandemic, and we find that the root of that word, we find the god Pan. And Pan was that that half human-esque, half kind of goatee satyr figure who represented the aspect of nature that was frightening. In the myths, Pan would leap out at the nymphs, he'd be hiding in a grotto or something like that. So it points to that aspect of nature that is unpredictable. We all like to relate to nature through very often these pastoral or bucolic images, but nature has this other side as well. And I wonder whether, if we start to think about if we look with a purposeful eye, what is it that this might be compensating in terms of the collective, our habitual way of looking at the world? Is it not a reminder of this aspect of nature, and therefore a call for us to perhaps have a more reverent, more conscious relationship with nature? If you think about what we know of the origins of the virus in this sort of exotic food market in China, right there we have an image of nature really being, well, literally caged and perhaps, not treated in a way that lends itself to the kind of respect and reverence that a lot of things today seem to be asking of us in terms of our relationship with nature. What this reminds me of psychologically is the way in which the archetypal world, if you go digging behind all the myth themes, you go back into the myths of creation and so forth, what do you come to? You come to these great polarities between light and dark, creation and destruction, life and death, obviously. That this is the great round of the universe, the cosmos. So we might think of these patterns as meta-archetypal, that behind all the specific archetypes is this sort of great spectrum of experience that we really can't get away from, even though we often pretend we can, that we can finally get above these things. And of course, the business of culture and civilization is all about not being slavishly caught in such patterns, not living them unconsciously or not simply being the victim of them. But that's the thing about psychology, that psychology calls us to keep certain things in consciousness even though they may not be lived out or enacted. And it just makes me wonder whether this virus, in a way, that the kind of consciousness that it is ushering us into may be something like an inoculation to an even larger darkness or disaster. So that's been one of my main thoughts. And just to finish off this piece of the virus, if we take that idea of being in the same boat, and what I'm suggesting is that in a way, what is that boat? Well, isn't it the archetypal cradle of our psychological experience? Comes back to these great patterns of the cosmos, these two sides of nature. And isn't what has come out of this virus a kind of more refined feeling for the human existential situation, an appreciation that the virus has been indiscriminate. It doesn't discriminate between levels of society. Of course, it has affected different people, and that plays into the next piece, the levels at which the Black American community have suffered are certainly greater. But in and of itself, it has this indiscriminance. And some of you may have saw the British philosopher Alan de Botton had a little piece on Camus' novel, The Plague, in the New York Times. And he says there, in keeping with this theme, being alive always was and will always remain an emergency. It is truly an inescapable underlying condition. Plague or no plague, there is always, as it were, the plague. If what we mean by that is a susceptibility to sudden death, an event that can render our lives instantaneously meaningless. Of course, that meaninglessness, in a way, catapults us into the search for meaning, but it's part of it. So he says, talking about Camus' novel, quoting the main character, this whole thing is not about heroism, this character says. it may seem a ridiculous idea, but the only way to fight the plague is with decency. And another character says, or asks what decency is. And the main character replies, doing my job. And I think that that's what we've seen. And we've seen people stepping up, doing their jobs. And there's a kind of nobility in that, but also a recognition of being together in it. So I wonder if that experience, in a way, primed our consciousness for our response to this killing of George Floyd. Now, in depth psychology and in Jungian psychology, we take the aims of social justice and human rights. That's assumed. I mean, what is our work for? What is individuation all about? It's not only to come more deeply into our own character, but it's also to realize how much a part of the human condition that we are, the way in which we share in that. So that's the starting point. But I do feel that this project of becoming more conscious is very much tied into what we've seen going on, that in a way the events are calling us into a greater level of consciousness. And here I want to get a little more specific, because in Jungian psychology, we talk about the persona, which is the face that you show to the world. And the persona is very often thought of as the opposite of the shadow, that when you, because most people are trying to kind of project the best side of themselves and so forth. And a lot of what's in the shadow is incompatible with this persona. So they say that, you know, if you're undergoing analysis, that the differentiation of the persona, to become aware that you're not just your persona, the role you play, the mask that you portray to the world, that there is other parts of you, that this is the first thing that needs to happen. It's like the doorway to the shadow is waking up to the fact that you're more than this persona. Now, think about this in terms of America. What is the American persona? Well, doesn't it have to do with its ideals? And don't those ideals go back to, for example, those great words of the Declaration of Independence? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, in the Pledge of Allegiance, ends with liberty and justice for all. So that's the ideal. But of course, the reality that we seem to be confronted again and again is the injustice, the inequality, and those two things have certainly collided in what has gone on recently. And as well as the surrounding energies, the energies that want to, in a way, keep that shadow side pushed down, and the energies that try to wake us up, to try to get us to see what is. So the Jungian work is to always to try to move towards the deeper character. What is the next stage of transformation? Where is the personality or the group in this case? Where is the next stage of development? So obviously, just the death of George Floyd, the killing of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, is in and of itself a terrible thing. And it is just the latest in a long line of such events. But something happened this time. Something snapped. And it seemed as though there was not only a kind of readiness, that it was a time for this to happen, but also that part of what was terrible were the images themselves, the police officer's knee on his neck, and those words now that have gone out around the world, I can't breathe, right? And so immediately there seemed to be a kind of groundswell of awareness that of something more than that this was symbolic, that it contained this sort of metaphorical suggestion of a larger, much larger problem. And I think some of you may have seen Al Sharpton's first eulogy in Minneapolis. And he drew this out. First of all, he quoted Ecclesiastes, to everything there's a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, and then put out the challenge of meeting that time, right? There is a time for awareness to break through. There's a time for absolutely necessary change, and that has to be recognized. But he went on to talk about the event itself as metaphorically significant for the whole Black American community. And he said, it's time for us to stand up in George's name and say, get your knee off our necks. White America with its knee on the neck of Black America. Now that is just a shattering image that has to be digested and met and metabolized. And I think that's what has been going on with the protest movement, a recognition of this larger significance of the event and a ritualizing of that. And of course, part of that, a big part of that is like lifting the lid, like shining the light on this part of American culture that's just allowed to kind of come up and sit back down, but not this time. Okay, there's too much energy, and so there's the exposure, but then there's also the accountability, and also what needs the demand for necessary change that really has to flow from that. Okay. Now, the work then that comes from this, from a specifically depth psychological perspective, we now talk about cultural complexes. this is an idea that's sort of taken root in the last 10 or 15 years in Jungian and depth psychology. We all know that we as individuals have complexes, but cultures and nations have complexes. And like our own complexes, national complexes have to do with constellations of past events. And so it's not just a matter of looking at what's happened, knowing there needs to be change. It's also a matter of trying to understand what these things are pointing to. And the challenge, in my mind, is can America look at its past? Can America culturally absorb, mirror, reflect this dark thread in its past that goes all the way back to the kind of Puritan sort of rejection of the first settlers, the rejection of the more natural side of life, the Native American genocide, slavery, all through to civil rights. And you can see the dynamic that I've been talking about, the repression, the sort of wanting to stick to the persona ideals versus this shadow that has just followed American culture all the way along. So part of the complex is the very repressive dynamic itself and the rejection of the compensatory movement that's trying to happen, that's been trying to happen for hundreds of years. These episodes that are about trying to bring these two parts at least into some kind of dialogue or relationship rather than them being dissociated. I just want to bring in on my refrigerator, I've for many years kept this cartoon, if I can hold it up in such a way, but there's an analyst who looks a little like Freud, and then Uncle Sam's on the couch with all these weapons. And Uncle Sam's saying, I have 1,800 nuclear missiles, 283 battleships, 9,400 planes. I spend more on my military than the next 12 nations combined. And despite spending more every year, I still feel insecure. And then the analyst says, it's simple. You have a military-industrial complex. So, of course, that's a great pun, play on the term, but it, I think, points to something deeper, and that is, well, let me put it as a question. What is it in the American psyche that is so defensive, that is so paranoid, that is so fearful of the other, and that is so willing to project that otherness instead of owning up to what it itself has not properly digested and integrated? So America's on the couch, and it's the challenge is, can it face its own wounds? Because in order to do that, to face the wounding would be to open up to that capacity to meet the other, the person on the street, and to be able to say, I know where you're coming from. I may not fully understand. I may never fully understand, but I need to understand, in order to address my own woundedness. And you see how this fits the sort of theme of the consciousness of the whole. And that doesn't mean, as I said, being conscious of anything, but of everything, but it means trying to be conscious of what's pushing up from the unconscious. And certainly we've got an example of that. There's a medieval proverb from the Christian tradition that says, light over darkness is the Antichrist, and light coming through the darkness, that's the Christ. And Jung encouraged us to look at religion symbolically, and of course with that we can see the psychology of it, that trying to cover up the darkness, that's where the problem is. But the ability to go into the darkness, to look at it head on, allows a sort of illumination to kind of come through the middle. And maybe that's, can we say, the deeper optimism, not to be superficially optimistic. There's way too much of that in this culture, but to be able to face the woundedness, face what's repressed, and discern that maybe there's a purpose that's trying to come through there. So let me finish with that and just say a couple of things, because again, the nature of this event is to speak most directly to those of you who are interested in perhaps applying to the program. We're very interested in people that do have a background in psychology of some degree. Or some form, but probably more so like a demonstrated interest in Jungian and archetypal psychology, either through your own reading or your sort of your own spiritual practice, or perhaps you've been in psychotherapy. The program is organized to give you a sort of very thorough education into the world of Jungian psychology, and we certainly start with a foundation, but it does help to have a feel for that, particularly if you're going to devote 3, 5 or more years to getting a Ph.D. We like to see people who have an MA, but a BA is a kind of minimum. And the other important thing is to show that you have some interest in research and writing. There's a lot of writing in the program, and of course, if you go all the way through to the PhD, you'll be working on researching, writing a dissertation. So that's important. And then I would say just a sort of general psychological mindfulness. We have a cohort learning model, which means that you go through the program with your own group of people, you're dialoguing with them online. So we like to see folks who can kind of have empathy, who can interact well, and people that may have, for example, spiritual interest or discipline as part of their own practice in life. And you probably know that our program is a hybrid program, which means that we meet on campus when we can meet on campus. We love to meet on campus 4 times a year for 4-day residentials. And then in between those residential sessions, we're doing work online. And perhaps during the question and answer period, I can describe that a little more, or the admissions folks can describe that. So we're right about 10 to the hour, and so let me turn it back to Jessica, and she can kind of open it up. We can talk about any aspect of what I've sort of put on the table here, and yeah, look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Slater. Let's get started with the Q&A portion. So again, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a little Q&A box, and you can feel free to type in the question, and then I will ask it to Dr. Slater. Okay, the first question is, do you believe it is the case that Americans experience defensiveness, suspicion, and mistrust of others to a larger extent than people of other cultures?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do. You know, you probably hear from my accent, I'm from Australia, and but I've lived in the United States for a quarter century, and I'm a citizen of the United States. It sometimes helps to have a little bit of an outsider perspective, but I think what makes it so in American culture is that America is so forward-looking. It's a frontier culture. It's so much about progress and innovation. And I use the word ideals. There's a great idealism in American life, the search for the more perfect union and so forth. And I think all of those they are qualities that lead to a great deal of creativity, a great deal of openness, but they do tend to sort of load up the shadow side, yeah, I think that maybe that would be the main thing I'd say there.
Thank you. Another question, can you speak about possible career opportunities and pathways after completing the program?
Yeah, so our program, if you've read any of the literature, is a non-licensure program. So we're not training people to be psychotherapists. We're not preparing you to be licensed as a clinical psychologist or marriage and family counselor. And what that means is we do get a lot of people who are already psychotherapists and they want a Ph.D., they want to do more writing, perhaps teaching, so forth. That's a big contingent. And then I'd say a second contingent are people who are already somewhat established in a career and they're trying to reinvent themselves. They want to add in this Jungian depth psychological perspective. We get people in law, we get people from the military, we get people in medicine and other kinds of helping professions, people in the arts, and their vision is to use this work, to these Jungian ideas, to move what they're already doing in a slightly different direction. And then I would say the third group would be maybe possibly some of our younger students who are hoping to get into academic life, a teaching position. There's not a lot of schools that teach Jungian psychology, but because the way we teach psychology is rooted in the humanities and the arts and so forth, it tends to open up to various kinds of opportunities on that level too. So that's the way I sort of broadly answer that.
We have a couple of questions that are related, so they could probably be turned into one question, but one question is, can you talk about the discussions and demands around police reform in Jungian archetypal ways? And the related question is there a particular archetype that drives white supremacy in the,
wow.
collective unconscious?
Wow. Yeah, well, on the first one, to me, it would be an extension of that key value of becoming more conscious. Part of the iconography, if you allow that expression, of the protest movement have been these moments where the police have crossed over. They've taken off their battle gear or whatever. They've walked over to the demonstrators, they've started dialogue, and very often started walking with them, marching with them, taking a knee. It seems to me that there has to be a deeper understanding of what has gone on in the Black community and how the Black community experiences the oppressive policing practices. And I think when there can be that kind of dialogue, there can be at least an attitude towards needing to, wanting to understand more. But, beyond that, in terms of specifics, I'm not sure. And in terms of the white supremacy, I think the way Jungians might understand that is that this is a projection of the sort of search for perfection onto a particular group or race. And you see the same thing in all sorts of fundamentalist thought movements where there's a perfect belief system, or there's a perfect teacher, or that this is the God. And that immediately sets up an enmity. It sets up the opposite, the thing then that's always attacking that, or that needs to be banished in order to allow. So, I would say that it has to do that. And in Jungian psychology, one of the understandings is that perfection and wholeness are contrasting values, because wholeness includes the cracks, the what's marginalized, what is all of the shadow elements that we've been talking about, the woundedness, the imperfections are part of the picture. And very often that search for perfection or superiority is a really defensive kind of posture against that deeper need for psychological inclusion and totality.
Thank you. So we'll close in about a minute or two. We did get one more question that I can answer. It is about accommodating program and students regarding current travel restrictions. So I just wanted to let everyone know who is going to be applying for fall, that fall term will be completely online due to the current restrictions, and we will be updating students as we go forward. As we get more public health orders, our main concern is the health and safety of our community. Glenn, did you want to add anything to that?
No, we've sort of transitioned to doing what we normally call our residential sessions online, mainly via Zoom. And so far it's gone very well. It's different, of course. People prefer to be face to face, but we seem to be doing quite well with that. And of course, we're all, if you've done a lot of Zoom meetings, you see where everyone's there and has their little window, and we still get to have the same dialogue and exchanges and so forth. So hopefully by winter we might be back on campus, but yeah, we'll just see how it goes. So Jessica, I'm happy to keep going until we've answered the questions, if we want to take a few more minutes.
Okay, I do see one more question, and then we can end there. Somebody wants help discerning between this program and the myth program.
Okay, that's a good question. If people can hear those dogs in the background, my neighbors have these Alaskan Malamutes, and their howl is something else. it's interesting that our program and the myth program are very often held side by side, and I'd say that one of the key differences is just where the depth psychological piece fits in. So of course, most of the programs at Pacifica have their way of doing psychology is along the Jungian archetypal lines. Of course, if you're doing one of the clinical degrees, you have to study other psychological perspectives and so on. But whereas our program puts that piece first, and of course folds the study of mythology, comparative religion, to some degree spiritual traditions into the background as a sort of support for understanding the archetypal nature of the psyche. In the myth program, it's the reverse, so that the study of the comparative religion and mythology is what comes first, and the depth psychological is the main, I would say, window into understanding that material. So very often when we have information sessions and so forth, people say, well, I'm interested in both. And what I say to them is, well, look at what's on your bookshelf. Are you primarily reading psychology, Jungian psychology, or are you primarily reading Joseph Campbell and myth and, story and so forth? So I think that's probably a good way to tell, where your interests are going to be met, at least.
Okay, so let's end there. Thank you so much for joining, everybody. And going forward, if you want to reach out to an advisor to find out more about the program, there's the information on the landing page as well, but the advisor for the program is Danny Valdez. That's dvaldez@pacifica.edu. Again, all the information is there on the landing page. For any general questions, you can also reach out to admissions@pacifica.edu. And I also wanted to let everyone know that if you haven't attended already, we are going to be having a virtual campus experience day on June 27th. It's Saturday, and so there will be a chance to hear a guest lecture from the counseling psychology program, as well as there will be a breakout session for each program. So if you are more interested in this program, you will get to attend a breakout session and ask more questions to the faculty of this program. And then there will also be the opportunity to talk more with admissions as well as other staff at Pacifica. So thank you again for joining, and we hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Okay.